On a slightly more hopeful note, I want to ask you just your thoughts on two big policy ideas that people have been talking a lot about recently. And I'll start with one that you are, I would say, a major reason people are talking about. The only reason I know what postal banking is because of you. And you've also helped write this
Yeah.
legislation, for Senator Gillibrand. What would postal banking do to help move the ball forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's this problem that I think is so catastrophic for people who have to deal with it, and totally off the radar for those of us who don't. And this is that there's a ton of the population, about 30 to 40% of the population, who has to rely on payday lenders and check cashers just to use their money or to send it abroad. And this is, 10% of their income. These are the people on the financial margins anyway. So I've done research onto this idea. And so I thought, look, I mean, let's just start with basic principles, right? Credit policy is a governmental policy, right? All banking, forget your free market ideals on corporations and businesses. We can quibble, but banking is a public endeavor, right? Banking is linked. All banks are linked to the Federal Reserve. We pretend that they're private markets, but we saw in 2008 that we cannot let the nation's banks fail. And what that means is that because banks operate with our money, right? So what that means is they are public utilities, essentially. So the idea that you have the Fed, not just a Fed, the FDIC, FHA, the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, not just generally day-to-day giving them credit support, but to the extent that they fail catastrophically, there's also a bailout. So once you have all of those governmental supports, you start to understand what banks are, and they're tools of a federal policy and monetary policy. They're connected to the state. So you have this industry, and it's profit-oriented, right? So the banks think that their interests are with the shareholders, but really the public supports them. And so they choose their customers. And what banks have chosen over the last 30 years is to only serve their wealthy customers and to screw them at that, but forget that for now. But to leave out that 40% of the public that it just isn't profitable for them to serve. So if you have less than $5,000 to deposit in a bank, those banks don't want you. That's why they do the overdraft fees. That's why they close up their branches in your neighborhood. And so those people, as soon as the banks left in the late 70s, early 80s, the payday lenders and the check cashers came in. This is a relatively new industry. So over the last several decades, you've got this void being filled with these loan sharks that are, taking the last, dollars and cents of the people who need it the most. And so the idea with the postal banking is, forget the post office for a second, right? It's just a public option for credit and for financial transactions. So banks have a monopoly on the payment system, which is the way, if you pay someone else, that check has to clear, and only banks have access to that clearing. But that's a public entity, that's a public, franchise, that's the Federal Reserve. And so just allowing the post office to do that, right? So offer an account at any post office is just as a public option. Why the post office as opposed to a public library? Several reasons. One is, in every developed country abroad, the post office does this. Two, in the U.S., from 1910 until 1966, the post office offered savings accounts. They were to, immigrants, poor people, phenomenally successful. And three, the post office has this mission to serve every community regardless of cost. I mean, it is the most democratic institution that we have, predates the Constitution. So it's very foundational to the American democracy. And Ben Franklin put this together. The founders decided on the mission of the post office. And this is why you have a post office in random rural areas that have nothing else. So it's in every zip code, and the post office should just do it. I mean, it's this is an idea. When people first hear of it, they're like, that's crazy. And then they hear more about it and they're like, that's obvious.
It's totally obvious.
It really,
yes. It couldn't make more sense. It's also, I also heard that Ben Franklin actually said that if you show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. Is that true, Professor? That's not true. Okay.
I'm sure
that was Malcolm X.
I think, yeah, maybe Abraham Lincoln. Or
that would, he's already really high. That would shoot him up several more points.
Yeah, totally.
So we need postal
Yeah.
banking. What about a federal job guarantee? What is your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's again one of those ideas. One where the devil's in the details. So I've heard a lot of debate on this, and people are like, no and yes, and I think it's because they have different plans in mind.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great idea if we conceive of it in the way that the New Deal era programs were done, but adapted for the 21st century, right? So the idea would be that, you create public sector jobs that we need, right? So we have awful infrastructure. We have terrible childcare programs. We have got, so many services that, quote unquote, like perfect markets just fail to perform, right? And we've got people out of jobs. We've got people being underpaid, and what David Graeber calls like tons of people in bullshit jobs, right?
Yes.
So the idea of the federal jobs guarantee is that you would create infrastructure programs that operate as a win-win, like postal banking, right? So we need a new highway, we need, solar panels, we need some new programs, new infrastructures, daycare, early childhood education, whatever, and you create the program and you fill the jobs. So that's one element of it. The other is the Federal Reserve component, which I think less people talk about, but it's just as important. The Federal Reserve, since the 1970s, has been like hyper-focused on inflation, as though that is like the big boogeyman. But it happened once, and it's like this trauma that they're still reacting against. That is not our worry right now.
Right.
We should, instead of focusing on inflation, focus on job creation and really understand that the Federal Reserve is behind credit policy and take that seriously. Looking at the bailout and the quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve did, what was that if not central planning and social engineering and deciding what things get funded? So the Federal Reserve should fund, public works, public programs, cities and states and localities. Like, why should AIG not be able to fail, but the city of Detroit fail? Or Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
So we make these decisions and we pretend like there's some, market reason behind it, but we're making moral policy decisions. And so the Fed should decide people over institutions with shareholders. And granted, the caveat is that, saving AIG does save a lot of pension holders. But I think there are a lot of ways to directly just understand what the Fed is and do it directly to just give credit where people need credit and give jobs where people need jobs and create programs that we need and fund them, because that money comes back in taxes. Money is not this like finite thing. Like the New Deal, even though it costs a ton of money, it actually creates a lot of money. It creates taxpayers. It creates the middle class and all of this wealth that just comes back to replenish the government coffers.
So virtuous circle. I want to just say in closing that I really, really appreciate your time. I look forward to many more conversations, and I'm anxious because I'm really going to need to get your name down. And I know we'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mehrsa Baradaran.
Mehrsa Baradaran.
Yay.
They're laughing at me. I'm going to really need to reassert my dominator hierarchy after this interview in a Jordan Peterson sense because of this. She is the author of The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, and a professor of law at the University of Georgia Law School. I really, really appreciate your time, and I'm very serious. I hope this is the first of many conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.